Hey, welcome to Freaking History, and we are talking a little APUSH today, and we're talking about the New South that occurred in the post-Reconstruction era. So if you're ready, let's get in there. There's a couple things you have to know. You're looking at continuity and changes during this time period from 1877 to 1898 in the South and rebuilding it. So one of the first things you need to know is the new industries that were put in. Steel production in Birmingham, lumber mills in Memphis, southern textile mills that were in Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Those were all changes because, again, the South was always based off of agriculture. And we're going to get to that in just one second. But there was a continuity, and that they did not have the financing and the financial institutions available to them as the Northerners did. So therefore, the investment into these Southern businesses and the extended railroads, et cetera, all were coming from Northern investors. Dang scallywags, dang carpetbaggers, them Yankees got to get out of here. Okay, a couple of terms that you need to know that have to do with this time period, and this is a little bit of a continuity. The idea of sharecropping. Sharecropping was an initial opportunity for work for a lot of African Americans in this post-slavery time period. But here's the thing that people don't realize, that sharecroppers, especially this 1877 moving into the 1890s, it wasn't about necessarily the former slaves, but it was also about the amount of whites that were also sharecroppers, Southern whites, as a way to make their living. But the problem is this. So it wasn't about black or white. It was about poor. And if you were poor, you might be put into a sharecropping situation that ended up to be a really bad deal. In short, the sharecropper would buy all the materials from the landowner. The landowner would take approximately half of his crop. But in the end, after the crop was harvested and the sharecropper paid the money back, the expenses somehow were more than what the crop was worth. And therefore then started the next cycle, which then the sharecropper would say, so I won't give you half, I'll give you 60% of my crop the next year, and on and on and on. And what that did is it continued to keep the sharecropper in debt. They called that slavery by another name, also known as debt peonage. Another thing that was happening in the South from a societal standpoint was segregation. Redeemers in the South were making sure that all of the African Americans were kept in their place, so to speak. And this was then the rise of the KKK. And I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but basically the Department of Justice was created because of the KKK during the Grant administration. He was able to... During this time period, there were a lot of Supreme Court cases that were striking down a lot of the laws that were meant to protect the African Americans. So this began a continuation of a downgrade of rights for the African Americans and the former slaves. Talked about, so a term you need to know, black codes. These were the old slave laws that they basically inserted the word Negro into them to try to create laws that kept African Americans kind of under wraps. Do things like limit occupations to servants or farm laborers. Even in some states, it prohibited them from even owning land. How could you be free and not have an opportunity to own land? Next, that led into what would become the Jim Crow laws. And that was after Reconstruction, and it replaced the black codes. And basically, it limited things like voting, it allowed intimidation, and it kept businesses separated. So for example, restaurants or hotels or stores, they could keep it as a black, white, separate, and that's who they would serve in their communities. That wouldn't end until the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965. Now, all this came to a head with the Pleasy versus Ferguson case in 1896. And that was where Homer Plessy was challenging a law in Louisiana about riding in a rail car that was to be segregated. What the Supreme Court in all its wisdom did was uphold that the separate but equal is fine as long you can keep the races separate as long as the facilities are equal. Here are some of the examples of some of the laws that were set because of segregation. There were poll taxes. You had to pay a tax to be able to vote. Literacy tests, which were, if you think about it, there was no education. It was illegal for African Americans prior to the end of the Civil War. So that was going to be an issue that wouldn't allow them to vote. There were also grandfather clauses because there were white people that were not educated as well, but if their grandfather owned land, then they would be able to vote. So there was always loopholes that would eliminate African Americans as opposed to white voters. African Americans could not serve on juries. So if there was any injustice that was done, they couldn't serve on the juries to find somebody either innocent or guilty, depending on what the situation is. And the development of lynch mobs, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Because of these situations, there was a response, and there's three individuals that we're going to continue to talk about, but that you need to know during this time period. The first is going to be Ida B. Wells. Now, Ida B. Wells was a journalist. She was anti-lynching, anti-Jim Crow laws. She had gotten affected personally by lynching, and if you're not sure what lynching is, it's basically taking the law into their own hands, and we'll talk a lot more about that because that is something that continues to happen throughout into the the 1900s, into the mid 20th century. Okay, the two other gentlemen that you need to know, and we'll be talking about them because they will come up in the progressive era as well, is going to be W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Start with Booker T. Booker T. Washington was a guy that thought, okay, if we grow economically as an African American community, then we will be gaining our rights over time as the white society accepts us as equals. He's best known for his speech, The Atlantic Compromise, that was talking about African Americans getting their rights over time and becoming accepted in the white community. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, going a complete different direction. He's like, why are we waiting? Why are we waiting? The 14th Amendment says we have our rights. Why are we waiting to get our rights? We already have them. What he wrote was The Souls of Black Folk, which was in 1903, and that's his signature literature talking about the rights of African Americans and what they should be expecting. Now, one area both gentlemen can both firmly agree on, that education for African Americans is key. And because the Freedmen's Bureau was kind of that beginning of that public education, and it wasn't upheld, especially in the southern states where many of the African Americans were, their education was falling behind. He felt that was going to be a key component, and they both thought that. So they agreed that education for African Americans was going to be a cornerstone for lifting the people out of the poverty.